Sameach. So nice to be together with all of you, the hardy ones who managed to get up the morning after the second Seder. I hope everyone was able to have a meaningful Seder experience, whether you were with people in person or on Zoom or both. And it's so special to be together. I thought for today, it would be nice to study a little bit of text together. And in particular, today I want us to look at a selection from Tractate Megillah, which Rabbi Lerner and his mother, Dr. Ann Lapidus Lerner, and me and my husband Matt studied in preparation for the Siyum on this past Thursday. And it may seem a little strange that I'm about to share a text from Megillah, which we know centers around Purim. Although I did recently learn that if you actually check the dates, the events of the Megillah take place in Nisan, in the month that we are in right now. And then they were about that day, which was 11 months later. So maybe more appropriate than you think. I haven't done the math, but I've been told. But also I chose this particular selection because it does feature a heroine of the Pesach story. I mentioned yesterday after services to folks who were asking, or I think 2 days ago, that I promised there would be more Miriam this holiday. So we will be talking about Miriam today. But before we look at the text, which Samantha will be sharing for us so we can all look at it, this is a text about prophetesses, female prophets. And so before we look at this text, I want to ask you, what does a prophet do? What is a prophet? What are our assumptions about that word? Elizabeth.
Well, I think we normally think of it as prophesying or foretelling the future. But I think more of the biblical prophets as only foretelling the future in the sense of they tell us how to behave and tell us if we don't, this is what will happen.
Great. So you just gave us two models of prophet. And in fact, in the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, it says, how do you know a true prophet from a false prophet? Well, you see what they say is going to happen. And if it happens, then they're probably a true prophet. And if it doesn't happen, they're a false prophet. So Elizabeth, you definitely got that first model correct. And your second model is also very prevalent, and especially when we look at a lot of the selections that we read from Haftarah, from the later prophets, where they're telling us this is how a person should behave. This is how you, the people, should behave. And if you do, this will happen. And if you don't, that will happen. Okay, so we've got some moral instruction as well. What else do we think about with prophets? Are there other models of prophets that we're familiar with? Harmon.
Well, they act as a voice for God.
Great. So they talk to God, and then they share what God has to say. And maybe it is foretelling the future, and maybe it is moral instruction, but maybe it's also broadly, there's some communication between God and the people. And we see that very prevalent, very much with Moses, right? He's going back and forth all the time. Okay. Have we exhausted our associations with prophets? Are there other kinds of prophets? What do we think?
There's ecstatic prophecy.
Wait, I heard this voice and it was coming from a box that was not in front of me. Who just said that?
Jonathan.
Jonathan, there is ecstatic prophecy. What's ecstatic prophecy?
Like in the story of Shaul with the prophets, kind of, I guess what we would think of as like wowie zowie kind of prophecy. Like I don't know, I don't know how to describe it except to say like having a vision or something like that, and kind of being all spiritual, but like in a way that seems like almost transcendental, I guess, or
Right.
transcending.
There are prophets who have a mystical experience,
That's good.
transcendent experience of God. And in fact, there is also some overlap between some of those other types of prophets and what you so beautifully called ecstatic prophecy, right? When we recite the Kedusha, we're reciting the words of Isaiah and Ezekiel, who, yes, they were a moral voice to the people from God, but they also had these experiences where they thought they were up in the heavenly throne room with these mystical beings. So I would say those were also wowie zowie experiences, as you said. Now, the prophet who I mentioned, who I promised I would talk about today, is Miriam. And so I'm curious, what model of, we know she's called a prophet. The Torah says, Vatikach Miriam Hanaviyah, right? Miriam, the prophet, took her timbrel in her hand, right? As Debbie Friedman has popularized that line. So we know that she is called a prophet. What kind of a prophet was she? Does she fit into one of these models? Seeing some of this. Anyone want to venture an answer? Yeah, Allison.
Well, she sort of was the person that knew in advance how important Moses was going to be, I think, because she was looking out for him to make sure that he would survive. Without her actually saying it, it was her actions.
Okay, so Allison, you are, first of all, you're pointing to the story where Miriam goes to watch and see what happens to Moses. And I think you're actually tapping into the midrash that we're about to read today. You and the rabbis are on the same wavelength because they also see that moment. And they also see, oh, she knows something that other people don't know. Okay, so we have a theory that Miriam is the kind of prophet who maybe can tell the future. That's one theory. What else? What do we know about? Yes, Ruth.
I believe Miriam also is kind of an interventionist. Like when she knew that Moshe needed to be nursed, she made sure that, even though he was being drawn out of the river by Pharaoh's daughter, that he had the wet nurse, which was his actual mother, that he should have.
Interesting. So she actually acts to make sure that certain outcomes happen. Is that prophetic? Is that something that prophets do? What do we think? Ruth, do you have thoughts about that? Yeah.
Well, it just seems like if she's gifted to be able to see into the future and she's able to actually make actions that will enable the right outcome to occur, that makes a lot of sense as a characteristic of a prophet.
Okay. It's also a characteristic of a leader, right? Which certainly her brother Moses is both a prophet and a leader, and he both maybe, gives some sort of moral instruction, and he also helps make things happen very much. Okay, so we have a question about this. Now, both of these might be a little tenuous, but right, we see glimmers of this in the text, but there's one particular thing that Miriam does in the text when she is called a prophet, right? Miriam, the prophet, took her timbrel in her hand. And so, Jonathan,
Yeah.
what do you think? Does this fit your model of ecstatic prophecy?
Depending on how she sang the song, right? I mean,
Okay. So depending on how she sang the song, when I imagine, Miriam leading the women in dance, that feels pretty like an ecstatic spiritual experience to me. So I think you may have actually hit the nail on the head on a model of prophecy that might really fit Miriam. So we're going to take a look at this text. The text from Masechet Megillah, the tractate Megillah in the Talmud, has a claim that there were 7 female prophets in the Bible. And it lists all 7 of them. And then it tries to prove that each one of them was a prophet. And it proves it specifically by trying to prove that they're in one particular model of prophecy. So we're only going to look at 2 examples today. But I want us to think about, does this actually feel like it fully encapsulates the characteristics of these women? And what are the rabbis trying to do as they're using these particular ways of describing the leadership of these women? So Samantha, we have a text to look at today. Fantastic. Sheva Neviot man minhu. Who were the 7 prophetesses? And the Gemara answers: Sarah, Miriam, Devorah, Hannah, Abigail, Hulda, the Esther. Now I have a question. If we were going to pick 7 women from the Bible who we were going to say were prophetesses, I'm curious, who here has heard of all 7 of these women? Okay, not a ton of hands. Can anyone here think of maybe other women that you might have expected to show up? Yeah, Rachel, who might you have thought of?
Well, and I apologize for the background noise that's clearly going to show up any second. I would have thought of Rebecca, who very clearly is one of the very few women who God actually speaks to, and who also acts to make sure that the message that she's gotten from God will be brought to fruition.
She's very active with that. So great. So if we say a prophet is someone who talks to God and a prophet is someone who acts on that, well, she's missing. She's missing from this list. Who else? Is there anyone else who feels like they're conspicuously missing from this list? Okay. Yeah, Rabbi Lerner.
Maybe Esther.
Great. Oh, so Esther is here at the end. Sorry, it's a little fuzzy maybe. So we have Esther, and we're not going to talk about her today because, we just had her holiday. But yes, Esther is on this list, which we might expect, right? We don't know if she talked directly to God, but we do know that she fasted and probably maybe prayed. She certainly fasted, and she certainly took steps to ensure a particular type of future.
I'll change it to Yael.
Yael, excellent. Who is Yael?
Yael was not Jewish.
Interesting. Yael was not Jewish, and yet, what did Yael do?
She's a big. Go ahead, Mike.
She eliminated an enemy of the Jewish people. Of course, at the time she did it, he had already lost.
Great, but she did, and it certainly took some courage. We also have Judith, who maybe wasn't in the Bible, so maybe that's why she's missing. She did the same thing as Yael. Yael used the tent peg, Judith used sword, but Judith was Jewish, so we've got both of these stories in there. Okay, so, but clearly this list of 7 doesn't feel obvious. Now let's just make sure we have some basic familiarity with each of these 7. So Sarah, I think we know. Sarah, married to Abraham, mother of the Jewish people, first of our matriarchs. We've got Miriam, who we've already started talking about, sister of Moses. We've got Devorah. Who was Devorah?
Judge.
Judge. She's got a song. Excellent. We've got Hannah. Who was Hannah?
Shmuel's mother.
Shmuel's mother, who invented, according to the rabbis, what?
Silent prayer.
She invented silent prayer. Okay. So maybe we can understand why she was called a prophet, right? If a prophet speaks to God, she certainly spoke to God. We've got Abigail. Anyone remember who Abigail is? Anyone know that story?
Wife of John
It
Adams.
was David's wife, right?
Yeah, David's
She
wife.
is one of David's wives. Yes. Her first husband was not such a nice guy. He didn't help David. His story doesn't end so well, but hers ends with marrying King David. So we've got Abigail. Hulda. Anyone heard of Hulda? If you've seen one of the Ushpizo posters that draws upon this midrash of the 7 prophetesses, then maybe you've heard of Hulda. Or maybe you've heard of Hulda because if you go to the Temple Mount, or rather to the external wall, the southern steps of the temple lead up to 2 gates that enter into the Temple Mount, and those are called Hulda's gates. But otherwise, probably never heard of her because we don't really talk about her very much, but she was a prophet. She was consulted about a particular matter. So we've got Hulda, she's a biblical prophet, and Esther. Okay, so now we're going to read our proof texts to see why is it that, how do we know that each of these women fulfills a particular model of prophecy that the rabbis feel they need to fit them into in order to prove that they're prophets? So let's see. Sarah Dichtiv. So here's our proof text for Sarah. Avimil v'avi Yiska. Okay, so we're looking at a genealogy from the book of Genesis. Haran was the father of Milcah and the father of Yiska. And the rabbis say, oh, that person Yiska, that's actually Sarah that we're talking about, right? So now we know like where Sarah fits into the family tree. For our purposes, we don't need to actually look at the family tree because what they're doing here is they're actually going to make a midrash about her name. By saying Sarah, her name was also Yiska. Well, what does the name Yiska mean? Yiska zo Sarah. So Yiska is Sarah. V'lama nikra shma Yiska. Why was she called Yiska? Shesachta beruach hakodesh. Sachta, she saw with divine inspiration. That's why she's called Yiska. It's a play on words. She saw with divine inspiration. Shene Emar, as it says in the Torah, Kol asher tomar alecha Sarah shma b'kola. So we might be familiar with that phrase. We read it on the high holidays when Sarah asks to basically get rid of Hagar, and Abraham doesn't know what to do. He asks God, what should I do? And God says, do whatever Sarah tells you, right? Listen to her voice. So the rabbis are saying, oh, listen to her voice. She must know something. She must have some divine inspiration. That's what this verse means. The reason you should listen to her is because she speaks with divine inspiration. That's how we know that Sarah was a prophet. Okay. And then we have another line that is actually kind of irrelevant to the prophecy conversation. But once we're mentioning that her name is Yiska, we're saying, oh, maybe it's because people who gazed on her beauty because she was beautiful. But that's a different midrash. So we've got Sarah saw with divine inspiration, therefore she was a prophet. Any responses or reactions to this midrash? I'm going to present it as a simple statement and proof text. Does that work for us? Yeah, Rachel.
Well, it's kind of problematic because it's saying her divine prophecy, her divine inspiration is in really the most unsavory episode that she's involved in terms of her treatment of Hagar. And so saying that that's the proof that she was in some way a prophetess is really, I think, a little hard to take.
Great. The matter about which Abraham's being told to listen to her is actually about abusing another person, right? So, okay, so there's something unsavory about this. Other thoughts? Yeah, Mike.
One of the things that bothers me is the alternative. The fact that she was beautiful should not enter into the equation. Those are the stereotypes we're trying to break free of, right?
Okay, so in some ways, Mike, what you're saying is they're actually saying that she saw with divine inspiration and not that she was so beautiful. Isn't it nice to see a woman who's being described as and praised for her relationship with God and not her beauty? Okay. Other thoughts? Which model of prophecy that we described is this fitting Sarah into? What kind of a prophet is she? Anyone? Is she
This
the
is
kind?
indirectly telling the future.
Great. Yeah, I think she is a prophet here who tells the future, right? They say she saw with divine inspiration, right? She's not giving moral instruction. She's not taking action to ensure the future. She's not having an ecstatic experience. She is predicting the future. That's the kind of prophet that she is here. So, regardless of how uncomfortable it may be for us that it comes from this particular episode, I think there's always a bit of a or often I see a bit of an enjoyment whenever we quote this line. Whatever she says, do whatever she tells you. Kind of even taking out of context, it might feel a little more comfortable. Just to think this is a broad instruction to him, not just about this moment. So we shouldn't forget our discomfort with that moment. But we see what the rabbis are doing here. They're describing her as a prophet who knows the future. Now, it might feel a little forced, and if it does, we should note it. And we move on to Miriam, who we've already noted. We might have a few ideas about where to place her, although I think we all had a little trouble figuring out where to place her. I think Jonathan's description of ecstatic prophecy worked well, which we'll come back to. But in this text, that's not the direction we go. Instead, we're going to go in Allison's direction for this one. We're going to see what the rabbis do with Miriam. Miriam dichtiv, vatikach Miriam hanaviyah achot Aharon. So they take that same verse that I had quoted. Miriam the prophet took her timbrel in her hand, but it's not just Miriam the prophet took her timbrel in her hand. It's Miriam, Aaron's sister, took her timbrel in her hand. And the rabbis say, why is she described as Aaron's sister and not Moses' sister? Well, when she prophesied, she was only Aaron's sister because Moses wasn't born yet. That's when her prophecy happened. So what's the story? What happened? How do we know? Omeret, she said, Atida imi sheteled ben sheyoshia et Yisrael. My mother will give birth to a boy who will save Israel. Uvisha'a shenolad nitmale kol habayit kulo ora. When he was born, the whole house was filled with light. Amad aviha benashka al rosha. Her father stood and kissed her on the head, and he said, Biti nitkamel nevuatayich. My daughter, your prophecy has been fulfilled. V'kevan shehishlichuhu layor, and when they had to throw him into the Nile, Amad aviha v'tafcha al rosha. Her father kind of tapped her on the head, knocked her on the head, and said, I'm reading from the Hebrew, Samantha, if you don't mind. I'll and then we can hold it on the English. Thank you. Tafcha al Rosha v'amarla biti heichan nevuatayich. My daughter, where is your prophecy now? Right? He's in the Nile. He's gonna die. Hainu dichtiv. This is why it says, Allison, vatitatsev achoto merachok, and his sister stationed herself from afar, ladat lade'a, to know. Ladat ma'yehe besof nevuata, to know what would happen to her prophecy. And we can scroll down to see that in the English as well. So this story, what does this story say about what kind of a prophet Miriam is? Anyone? What kind of a prophet is Miriam in this story?
This is also future telling.
Absolutely. 100%. This is also future telling. She knew something about Moses, right? She does do something about it, but this is really not focusing on the action. It's focusing on the fact that she was watching to see, oh, is my prophecy going to happen, right? She is a future telling prophet. Okay. So how do we feel? How do we feel about this as a description of Miriam's prophecy? Does this do it for us? This is the rabbi's proof text. How do we like it?
It's incomplete.
Okay, say more.
Well, it speaks nothing of her experience after dancing with the timbrel and the well and all her other appearances in the story.
Great. So if you just look at this, it seems like she prophesied once as a little girl, and that's it. Right? It seems like it's a one-time thing because it only happened when she was Aaron's sister, not when she was Moses's sister, right? So there's something that feels incomplete. Now, I will remind us that both this story and the story of Miriam's well are rabbinic midrashim. They're not in the Bible. But you're pointing out that there are these episodes that are, this is one specific episode that happens in the midrash, not in the Torah, and it's saying, yeah, that's how we know she was a prophet. Okay, so Lewis said it's incomplete. What else do we think? Yeah, Elizabeth.
Well, I think what is in the Bible is her singing and leading the women. And as you said before, the ecstatics, when you think of the singing and the dancing, think of Hasidim.
Great. Her ecstatic prophecy is totally missing. Her leadership of the women is totally missing. The actual story in the Bible that is associated with her being a prophet is totally missing from here. So that's really notable. That's really interesting. Okay. So Miriam's leadership and Miriam's prophecy looks like one thing in the Bible, but it looks like a different thing in the Midrash. Rachel.
So I was thinking about that, and I guess, maybe part of it is you can't bring a proof text from the thing itself. Like the verse is Vatikach Miriam Nevi'ah. Like that's the claim that she is a prophet is from that story. But if you used that story as the proof of that statement, then it's just, I was about to say like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's not that. But it's almost a tautology. Like you can't use the thing to prove itself. You have to find a proof text somewhere else. And so they have to go to this midrash to prove it.
Well, you could say, well, how do we know that Miriam was a prophet? Because the text says she was, right? Actually, we don't need to look any further, right? With these other women, they're not called prophets, but Miriam is called a prophet. So maybe we don't need to look any further, but the rabbis did need to look further. They actually weren't satisfied with just the label of prophet for her. And so it makes one wonder if somehow this model of ecstatic prophecy wasn't obvious to them that it was prophecy, right? Maybe they felt there was something lacking there. We did move on from Sarah's leadership, but I want to go back to it for a moment because I also want to compare how Sarah is being depicted in the Midrash versus in the biblical story. In the biblical story, was she a leader? And if she was, what did her leadership look like? Anyone? Obviously, we talked about this incident of her mistreating Hagar, but we know a little bit more about her, not a lot. What do we know about Sarah?
I
Sheila.
found her
she's pretty passive. She's like, you're my sister, you're my wife. You know, she follows orders. She doesn't really,
Right. She follows
until
order.
Hagar, she really doesn't show resolve.
Great. So she doesn't seem to do very much. We know that when Abraham hosts the guests, she does the cooking, right? We know she stays back in the tent and listens and laughs when Abraham is told that she's going to have a child. So we don't know that much about her. She might not be a leader. The rabbis do see her as a leader. They say when Sarah and Abraham, came and traveled and did their thing, Abraham converted men to becoming Israelites, and Sarah converted the women. So they actually see her as being taking an active leadership role, but it's not so clear from the text. So what we're seeing in both of these midrashim is that there's the biblical persona, and then there's the midrashic persona. And the midrash is going in a particular direction. So here's what I want to think about briefly, which is it seems to me that what's happening here is that when the rabbis think about prophet, they think about someone who tells the future. And that is what prophecy means for them. And for them to say, actually, women can fit this definition too, I think is pretty profound and pretty significant, right? They're living in a world where women's leadership and men's leadership looks really different. And they're saying women can do this too. Women can also foretell the future. And let me show you how. I think that's pretty significant. And that's pretty, that's pretty impressive. That's pretty open of them to think about that. And at the same time, I think that there are models of leadership here that they're missing, because they have an idea that this is what leadership or this is what prophecy looks like. They're missing that ecstatic prophecy, even though Jonathan very nicely showed us about lots of other men who have this model, but that's maybe not the primary thing that we think about when we think about those prophets. And so I think they missed it. I think they missed the ecstatic prophecy of Miriam, that was her leadership that was significant. And so part of what I want us to just spend the next 2 minutes thinking about is what, I think there are ways in which it's really valuable and important to say that people who we're not used to seeing in X models of leadership can do that. And it's also valuable at the same time to say, maybe there are multiple models of leadership that we don't always notice. And maybe we need to elevate those as well. So I'm curious for you, does this idea of models of leadership resonate? Are there models of leadership that resonate for you personally, either in yourself or in other people? And do those feel like the models of leadership that are most lifted up in our society? That's kind of a heavy question, so I'm going to give it a few minutes to wait for some hands to trickle up. What models of leadership work for you? Mike?
I really don't have a direct answer, but I do want to reference all of the amazing work that the Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs Zatzal has done in the area of leadership, sometimes going from parsha to parsha with the theme of leadership throughout. There's a whole year's worth of reading there.
Great. And I think the fact that you can have that much reading about leadership and models of leadership is a reminder that there are lots of different ways of doing it. Other thoughts? What models of leadership resonate for you? What models of leadership do you think are maybe not given enough credit? Yes, Rebbe.
So I do a little seminar with my kids on leadership, and one of the things that I point to is, I don't know, I go to a lot of seminars, and I don't know if you've ever been in a seminar that's just going on too long. They need a break. It's going on for an hour and a half. There's just someone up there talking, and at around the hour and a half mark, someone decides they need a cup of coffee or something, and they get up, just quietly by themselves, get up and go get a cup of coffee. And as soon as people see that, everybody else now has permission to go get a cup of coffee. And, that type of leadership is not the type where you stand in front of a group and say, I want you to do this, or this is the thing we need to do. It's kind of leading by example and leading quietly by what you do, without necessarily the intent of causing anything else to happen, but in fact, making things happen.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Anyone else? Now that Strebby's led by example, does anyone else want to raise their hand? Yeah, Elizabeth. You unmuting there?
Yeah, I have to get my picture first. Excuse me. In some ways, I think it was really great that the rabbis decided at a certain point to find a few female prophets. But I think to some extent, they were very unaware probably of what various women did, because they didn't really pay attention. The women did their thing and the men did their thing, and the women may have had a lot of leadership among other women that we don't know about.
Great. So somehow in elevating, particularly Miriam, because I really think that Miriam, of all of these 7 prophets, she, in some ways, the way she's described in the Bible, that model of leadership clearly is something different that they're not necessarily noting. They don't know what to do with it in the same way. And so I think you're right. It's both wonderful that they want to say, oh yeah, women can do this too. Women can also tell the future and fit into that model of leadership. But at the same time, that actually highlights for us the way that maybe they're missing this other type of spiritual leadership, which clearly was really powerful, especially if it made it in to the Torah, where we don't hear about a lot of women's leadership. Beautiful. Do we have another comment? Anyone else? Yeah, Ruth. You're still muted. Try again.
Thank you. With the screen share, it's hard to get your
Yeah.
bearings sometimes.
Yeah, maybe we can take that down actually.
Oh, that's better. Okay. All right. Okay. So I just want to call out, the leadership of women in everyday life, and particularly in family life. And back in the days when the rabbis were determining who they were going to deem to be leaders, I agree with the last comment. I think it was Elizabeth who said, they just may not have been tuned in to all that was going into managing the family life. And, women have historically been leaders in quiet ways, but their leadership in the family has had an enormous impact on the overall society.
Yeah, beautiful. And that's something that's very often been overlooked as being an area of leadership and importance. Okay, do we have one more comment? Back to Elizabeth.
Now, I'm now going off of what Ruth just said, because when you mentioned before, why isn't Rivka in here? Because her husband was kind of a milquetoast. And she was the one who had to take the reins to make sure that the Hebrews survived.
Yeah. So maybe the overlooking of Rivka is also in some ways an indication of what's going on here, right? An indication of missing some of those family leadership pieces, right? She did speak to God. She did act to make it happen, and it was all in the realm of family. So perhaps. Okay. Barbara.
Muted
Wait, you just got muted. Yeah.
myself. What I'm really appreciating in this discussion is the understanding that leadership doesn't just happen from the top of an organization or a country or a people, but leadership happens throughout, and that there are many models of leadership, and that wherever somebody takes initiative or takes action or does something to bring other people along, that is leadership, and that the whole system is led by many people, not just one leader at the top. So that's what's been coming up.
Oh, wait, you just muted yourself.
So that's what's been coming up for me, you know, whether it's women or you know, all of us. That's what I've really appreciated in this discussion, that there are many models, many types of leadership, and that leadership can happen throughout an organization or a community or a family.
Fantastic. And we're gonna end on that note, and with the hope that each of us can learn to both display and recognize a variety of different types of taking initiative and of leadership and of influence in other people. And I think the more that we can do that, the more we can actually benefit from the very different kinds of contributions that all of us have to give.